1924, introduced by Pope Francis, and ended on January 6th, 2026. So we have passed through that centenary jubilee of hope, but that hope remains with us. It is a great lesson and a great reminder of the love of Christ, the love of God for us all. No matter what we do in life, no matter what we do, the Lord gives us a second chance. No matter how we foul things up, there is always a second chance. And that is one of the basic things of the Jubilee year, that God is merciful, and that even no matter how bad we are, or how disgraceful our life is, or how this bad is accused, or whatever, is a new beginning. And Francis was with for 25 years, but he, of course, also, as you know, died in the middle of that year and was succeeded by Pope Leo XIV. That was a huge surprise in the life of the Church, and I'm sure it was a surprise for you, and a surprise for me, and a surprise for many people in the United States. A friend of Pope Leo, who was a fellow Augustinian, wrote to him before the election, and he said, congratulations, you are going to the conclave. You will be able to see everything, and you have at least an outside chance of being elected Pope. And Leo was, at that time, he was Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost. He wrote back to him and said, I'm happy I'm in America. There is no chance I'm in America. So that's the way we think. But God has different spirit, has different ideas. And it is a great blessing, of course. The new Pope brings his own approach, brings his own style, and brings something of America to the papacy. He is also, of course, a citizen of Peru and a missionary there for 35 years. So he brings that as well. He's Peruvian American. But I would like, you see, this page here gives us the very first words of his speech. And he was elected Pope. The very first things that he said. This is a quotation from him when he was a cardinal. And it's nice to compare the two. But the speech at his installation is coming out on the balcony, starts off with the word together. Together. And that is a very strong statement in itself, in one word, that we are together. He immediately called out to the people in the square and the people around the world who were listening in and looking in at that moment to be together, that we are together. Together, we must look for ways to be a missionary church. It's amazing how he was able to sum up in those first words his approach and the style of his papacy. He wants us to work together. He does not say, I will send you an encyclical next month or anything like that. He said, there right in the beginning together. And that is very significant, that very first word that he used, together. He wants us to work together, and to work together, to be, we must look for ways, together we must look for ways to be a missionary church. He had that experience in Peru. He knew what it was himself, and he is passing that on to the whole church, and that is part of his gift to the church. We must look for ways to be a missionary church, a church that builds bridges and encourages dialogue, a church ever open to welcoming, like this square with its open arms, this St. Peter's Square, all those who are in need of our charity, our presence, our readiness to dialogue, and all that. That is the first paragraph of his statement when he was elected Pope. And he captures something of the spirit of what he is working on. And he wants us to work, to look for ways to be a missionary church. So that is really the topic of my talk this morning. How do we look for ways to be a missionary church? Now, we all know of the missions. We all know of the foreign missions. Some of us were on the missions. I was on missions in Africa for 11 years. And O'Neill was in Peru for 35 years. We know what it is to be a missionary, a foreign missionary. But he is talking about the church at large, to be a missionary church. We can break that down and say, how are we a missionary parish? And sometimes we rejoice we have that spirit of being a missionary parish. How can we be a missionary church in our homes? How can we be a missionary family? Maybe that is much more difficult to work out. How can we look for ways to be a missionary church and a missionary parish and a missionary family? That applies to every group. It applies to us Carmelites. It applies to you lay people. It applies to every little group in the church that we are called to be a missionary church. That missionary element has to be part of our apostolate, part of our work, of our service to the church, and part of our families. Maybe the families it's most difficult, but it is part of the missionary church. Every family is part of the missionary church, and to look for ways to be a missionary church in our homes. Father Philip has that great quotation of his mother when he was sent to help out in Uganda. The mother said, we have a popes of my own life who made an impression on me. And that is a way that we can grow in our faith and that we can live the gospel. If you remember, and we could go back maybe in my lifetime or in your lifetime, go back to the popes that we knew or experienced in our lives. The first pope that I recognized or knew anything about was Pius XII. You remember Pius XII? You're young guys, so you don't remember back then. Pius XII was a great pope, but for me, he seemed to be distant and very, very honorable, very upright, even in stature, and somewhat distant from everyday life. That was Pope Pius XII. Then after Pius XII, we got John the 23rd, who was a breath of fresh air. He was jolly, he was rotund, he was able to laugh, and somehow he captured the hearts and the minds of people easily. And then, of course, the big event of his life was the opening of the Vatican Council that people said was impossible. And yet he did it. He did it, and he did it well. And he did not live for the end of the council. That was the next pope. The next pope was Paul VI. And he brought his own strengths and his own abilities, his own talents to bear on the life of the church. You might remember he was the one that wrote the famous encyclical on marriage, about contraception and difficulties in marriage. It wasn't very popular at the time, but it has proved to be very genuine and very helpful. He also wrote other encyclicals about devotion to Mary in the life of the church, that it had changed through the influence of Vatican II, and he felt the need of a new encyclical, and it wrote a very good encyclical on devotion to Mary. And he had other events in his life that were very powerful. Then, he was followed by Pope John Paul I. And I'm sure no one remembers John Paul I except that he lasted 35 days. He didn't last very long. He died suddenly after 35 days. But people remember him as something as a friendly and a smiling pope. He was followed by John Paul II, whom we all know. We've all heard of John Paul II, our Polish pope. And he was truly a great leader and a great holy man and a great leader, not only in the church but in the world. I recently got the gift of a book for my birthday, and it was last year's birthday that I got it for. It was called A Pope and a President. The Pope was John Paul II. Who was the president? Ronald Reagan. You know your history. Yeah, it is very, very interesting bringing the two of them together and seeing how they developed a friendship and how they worked against the communist ideals of the time and worked very successfully. John Paul in Poland church. But he turned out to be a very gracious gentleman as a pope, although he got into trouble with the Muslims in some statement that he made about the Muslims. And every pope makes mistakes and speaks out of line in some way or offends someone. Jesus offended a lot of people in his life. But John Paul II was truly a great pope in our era, in our times. He was succeeded by Benedict. Benedict did what was good and what was right, and surprised everyone by retiring. He was succeeded by Francis, another different character, another different personality, and sometimes very spontaneous, very outspoken, and willing to say what was on his mind or whatever came into his mind at the time, whereas other popes were more cautious to say something. They knew that as popes they would be quoted, and they had to be careful about what they said and how they said it. Francis big boo-boo was the time he was returning from a trip, and some newspaper writer asked him what did he think of gay marriages, and what did he think of gay people in the church. And his spontaneous answer was, "Who am I to judge?" And of course, that was picked up immediately. Who am I to judge? That was picked up that he was in favor of gay marriages. He was in favor of gay people doing everything in the church. So it was not true, but that's the way his personality affected the papacy. So likewise, the personality of Leo affects our church too, and will affect our church. We still do not know how it will affect the church, but we get some idea from this opening statement. Together, we must look for ways to be a missionary church. Now, you might have read about the meeting that he had with the cardinals at the beginning of the year. I haven't heard much about it, but I've seen photographs of the cardinals and the Pope in discussion, and it's very interesting. They were all divided. Divided up into groups of five cardinals, and sitting down at a round table discussing the issues that were on the table. And that's something of the togetherness, that we need to sit down together in small groups, in a small group like a family, and work to bring ways, to find ways to be a missionary church. That is, the photographs that I saw was of Pope Leo in his white robes, in his white soutane, and the others in their clerical outfits that were discussing various things. I don't know what was the outcome of that meeting, but it certainly brought out the personality of Leo, that he wants to work together. He wants to work together with the cardinals. He wants to work together with the church. He wants to listen, to build bridges, and to